What if the cross had never cast its shadow across history? What if the nails had never found their mark, and the crown of thorns had remained woven from ordinary branches? What if Jesus had lived to grow old, teaching under olive trees, while his hair turned silver like moonlight? Tonight, we drift into a world where love conquered through living, not dying, where the greatest story ever told took a different turn, in a world where the wooden beams remained stacked in the carpenter's yard, where the hill of Golgotha knew only the gentle footsteps of shepherds and their flocks. History unfolded like a scroll, written in different ink entirely. The Roman soldiers, who had sharpened their spears that morning, found them unneeded, as Pontius Pilate made a choice that would echo through millennia. Not the choice recorded in Scripture, but another possibility that existed in the space between what was and what could have been. Perhaps it was the dream his wife had spoken of, more vivid this time, more insistent. Perhaps it was the strange peace that seemed to emanate from the man standing before him, a calm so profound it made the governor's marble halls feel suddenly sacred. Or perhaps it was simply the weight of morning light falling through the windows in patterns that reminded him of his own mortality, his own need for mercy, in a world where power was fleeting as morning mist. "I find no fault in this man," Pilate declared, and this time his words carried the weight of decision rather than the weakness of washing hands. The crowd's roar of disapproval crashed against the palace walls like waves against cliffs, but it could not penetrate the strange certainty that had settled over the Roman's heart like armor made of starlight. Jesus walked free that day, his sandals carrying him through Jerusalem's gates as the sun climbed higher, painting the ancient stones in shades of gold and hope. The disciples, who had scattered like leaves in a windstorm of fear, gathered again with faces bright with disbelief and joy. Mary Magdalene wept tears that caught the sunlight and threw it back in tiny rainbows, each drop a prayer of gratitude to a God who had chosen mercy over sacrifice. But freedom brought its own challenges in a world not ready for the revolution of love he preached. The religious leaders who had demanded his death did not simply forget their opposition because Roman justice had spoken. They watched and waited, plotting in shadowed corners, their hearts hardened against the possibility that this carpenter's son might indeed be everything he claimed to be. Love, they had learned, was often more dangerous when it was allowed to grow than when it was cut down in its prime. Jesus understood this with the wisdom of someone who had glimpsed eternity and chosen to remain among mortals for reasons that transcended human understanding. He had work yet to do, words yet to speak, hearts yet to heal, in a world that desperately needed to learn that divinity could dwell among them, not as a distant concept, but as a daily presence, walking dusty roads and sharing simple meals. After many seasons had painted the landscape in cycles of death and rebirth, Jesus had established something unprecedented in human history, a community built on principles that defied every social structure the ancient world had known. In a small valley outside Jerusalem, where olive trees grew thick and springs bubbled up from underground rivers that seemed to flow with liquid hope, a new kind of society began to bloom like flowers in impossible soil. Here, former tax collectors shared their bread with reformed zealots. Their differences dissolved in the presence of someone who saw past their histories to their essential hearts. Roman centurions, drawn by stories of healing that traveled faster than official dispatches, came seeking not conquest but peace for souls weary of violence. Samaritan women drew water from wells alongside Jewish merchants, their ancient hatreds evaporating like morning dew in the warmth of radical acceptance. The teachings that had once been whispered in fishing boats and delivered on mountainsides now had time to take root, to grow deep as cedars, to spread like gentle wildfire through communities hungry for a better way to exist. Jesus, no longer constrained by the urgency of approaching death, could plant seeds of transformation that would mature slowly, naturally, like gardens tended by patient hands that understood the sacred rhythm of growth. His hair, once dark as Mediterranean nights, began to show threads of silver that caught sunlight and threw it back in patterns that made children laugh and reach out to touch what looked like captured starlight. His hands, calloused from years of carpentry, grew gentle from constant blessing, from laying palms on fevered foreheads and speaking words that made diseases retreat like shadows before dawn. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was not in those he healed, but in the slow, steady evolution of human consciousness that his continued presence made possible. Without the dramatic punctuation of crucifixion and resurrection, his message had to prove itself through the quieter miracles of daily life, communities that cared for their weakest members, forgiveness that actually changed hearts, love that grew stronger through practice rather than being preserved through sacrifice. The Roman Empire, that great machine of conquest and control, found itself confused by this growing movement that seemed to have no interest in political power, no desire to overthrow governments or establish earthly kingdoms. How do you fight an enemy whose only weapon is unconditional love? How do you suppress a revolution that seeks to transform oppressors into friends rather than replace them with new tyrants? Pilate, now older and somehow gentler, would sometimes ride out to the valley community just to observe this impossible social experiment with the curiosity of someone watching history unfold in directions no scholar had predicted. A few decades later, when the first gray had become silver, and silver had begun its gentle dance toward white, Jesus found himself surrounded by something that had never existed before. Multiple generations of humans who had grown up knowing that divine love was not a distant promise, but a present reality walking among them. Children who had never known a world where healing was impossible, where forgiveness was conditional, where love was limited by tribe or tradition. These young ones played games that involved washing each other's feet, sharing their toys before they were asked, resolving conflicts through conversations that would have impressed ancient philosophers. They grew into adolescents who approached their mistakes with curiosity rather than shame, understanding that error was simply another opportunity for grace to demonstrate its transformative power. The ripple effects spread far beyond the valley community. Merchant caravans carried stories of this place, where no one went hungry, where sick travelers were welcomed and healed regardless of their ability to pay, where disputes were resolved through dialogue rather than violence. These tales, told around campfires from Jerusalem to Rome, from Alexandria to Athens, began to shift something fundamental in human consciousness. Other communities, inspired by these stories, began experimenting with similar principles. Not all succeeded. Human nature proved stubborn, and old patterns of greed and power died hard as winter weeds. But enough communities flourished that a new model of civilization began to emerge, one based on cooperation rather than competition, on abundance shared rather than scarcity hoarded. Jesus, now an elder whose presence could calm storms, both meteorological and emotional, spent his days teaching a different kind of apostle, the children and grandchildren of his original followers, young people who carried his message not as a burden inherited, but as a gift discovered fresh each morning. His parables evolved too, becoming stories about the complexities of maintaining love across generations, about the patience required to transform cultures rather than individuals. The Romans, meanwhile, found their empire slowly transforming from within. Soldiers who had been stationed near the valley communities returned to their legions changed, carrying practices of mercy and justice that spread through the ranks like beneficial infections. Governors discovered that territories influenced by these teachings required fewer troops, generated less rebellion, produced more prosperity for everyone. Some historians of this alternative timeline would later argue that this was how divinity had always intended to work, not through dramatic intervention, but through the slow, patient cultivation of human hearts until love became as natural as breathing, as automatic as sunrise, as inevitable as the changing seasons. 100 seasons after that pivotal morning, when Pilate chose differently, Jesus stood on a hillside overlooking a world that bore little resemblance to the one into which he had been born. The Roman Empire still existed, but it had evolved into something unrecognizable, a confederation of communities united not by conquest, but by shared commitment to principles that elevated human dignity above political power. The gladiatorial arenas had been transformed into theaters, where stories of redemption and reconciliation were performed for audiences who wept openly at tales of enemies becoming friends. The Colosseum itself had become a vast garden where former slaves and former masters worked side by side, growing food that was distributed freely to anyone who needed it. Slavery had not been abolished by decree, but had simply withered away as communities discovered that voluntary cooperation produced better results than forced labor. Why own another human being when partnership created more wealth, more joy, more innovation than oppression ever could? The economic systems that had been built on exploitation evolved into models of mutual benefit that economists would puzzle over for centuries. Even more remarkably, the various religious traditions that had once viewed each other with suspicion and hostility had begun to recognize common threads in their deepest teachings. Synagogues and temples and early Christian gatherings often shared resources, learned from each other's wisdom, found in their differences not threats but opportunities for expanded understanding of the divine mystery. Jesus himself had become something unprecedented in human history, a living bridge between the mortal and eternal, someone who demonstrated daily that the boundary between human and divine was more permeable than anyone had imagined. His continued presence meant that questions about his nature could be explored through relationship rather than theology, through experience rather than doctrine. The miracles continued, but they had become so woven into the fabric of daily life that they seemed natural rather than supernatural. Healing happened not just through his touch, but through communities that had learned to create environments where bodies and souls could mend themselves. Feeding multitudes occurred not through multiplication of loaves and fishes, but through economic systems that ensured no one went hungry while others had abundance. Yet perhaps the greatest miracle was the transformation of human imagination itself. People could now envision societies based on love because they had seen such societies function. They could believe in the possibility of peace because they had experienced generations without war. They could trust in the reality of grace because they had watched it operate as reliably as natural laws. Children born into this world took such wonders for granted, the way children in any era accept the marvels of their time as simply the way things are. After countless moons had witnessed the steady transformation of human civilization, when Jesus had lived long enough to see his great-great-grandchildren playing in gardens that had once been battlefields, a new challenge emerged that no prophet had foreseen. The very success of love as a governing principle had created a generation that had never known suffering, never experienced the kind of loss that traditionally drove people to seek spiritual comfort. These young ones, raised in abundance and security, began to ask different questions than their ancestors. If love was so natural, so easily achieved, then what made it special? If healing and forgiveness and community care were simply how the world worked, then where was the mystery, the transcendence, the sense of the sacred that human hearts seem to crave? Jesus, now ancient by any measure, but somehow still vital in ways that defied biological explanation, faced this paradox with the same patient curiosity he had brought to every other challenge. How do you maintain the sense of miracle when miracles have become mundane? How do you preserve the sacred when the sacred has become ordinary? His response was perhaps his most sophisticated teaching yet. Rather than artificially creating hardship to generate appreciation, he began to reveal the infinite depths that existed within seemingly simple acts of love. A shared meal became an exploration of cosmic interconnectedness. A conversation between former enemies became a meditation on the nature of forgiveness that could heal not just individuals but entire bloodlines stretching back through generations. He taught these children of paradise that the absence of dramatic suffering did not mean the absence of meaningful challenge. There were still mysteries to explore: the nature of consciousness itself, the relationship between individual identity and universal love, the question of how finite beings could participate in infinite compassion without losing their essential humanity. Art and music and literature flourished in this world as creative souls found in abundance, not complacency, but inspiration. Without the need to focus energy on mere survival, human creativity could explore territories that previous generations had never had the luxury to contemplate. Symphonies were composed that seemed to capture the sound of planets singing. Paintings were created that made viewers weep with joy at the beauty of existence itself. Science advanced too, but in directions that earlier civilizations might not have recognized as scientific. Researchers studied the physics of forgiveness, the chemistry of compassion, the biology of what happened in communities where love was the primary organizing principle. They discovered that human beings were far more malleable, far more capable of evolution than anyone had previously imagined. The great libraries of this world contained not just accounts of what had been, but detailed studies of what became possible when humanity chose cooperation over competition as its primary strategy for survival. In the 3rd century of this alternative timeline, when Jesus had become a figure whose presence seemed to exist simultaneously in multiple places, whose teachings had evolved into something more like ongoing dialogue with the collective human consciousness, a remarkable discovery was made. Scholars working in the Great Library of Alexandria, now a cooperative venture rather than a royal possession, found ancient texts that described what their world might have been like if history had unfolded differently. These scrolls spoke of crucifixion and resurrection, of a faith built on sacrifice rather than presence, of religions that divided humanity rather than uniting it. The descriptions seemed like dark fantasies to readers who had grown up in a world where such concepts made no sense. Why would divinity choose to demonstrate love through suffering when it could demonstrate love through flourishing? Why build hope on death when life offered so many opportunities for transformation? Yet these alternative histories served an important purpose in their society. They became cautionary tales, reminders of how easily human nature could turn toward destruction if not carefully cultivated toward construction. They were studied not as religious documents, but as psychological texts, explorations of the shadow potentials that existed within every human heart. Jesus himself would sometimes reflect on these alternate possibilities during his evening walks through the valley that had become his home. He could sense, in dimensions beyond ordinary perception, the echoes of those other timelines where his story had ended differently. In some strange way, he carried within his consciousness the memory of all the ways his mission might have unfolded, all the different sacrifices that love might have demanded. This multiplicity of awareness had become one of his most profound teachings in recent decades. Reality, he suggested, was not a single story, but an infinite symphony of possibilities, all playing simultaneously in the great concert hall of existence. The timeline they inhabited was not the only one, simply the one they had chosen to explore together through their collective choices. But choice, he reminded his followers, was an ongoing responsibility, not a one-time decision. Every day, every moment, every interaction offered opportunities to either strengthen the fabric of love that held their world together or to tear small holes in it that could, if left unattended, grow into larger rents that might threaten everything they had built. The communities that had grown up around his teachings had developed sophisticated practices for maintaining this vigilance without falling into paranoia. They had learned to hold both deep gratitude for what they had achieved and humble awareness of how fragile such achievements could be. Love, they discovered, required constant tending, like gardens that could produce abundance or return to wilderness depending on the attention they received. Children in this world grew up understanding that they were not inheriting paradise, but participating in its ongoing creation, that each generation had to choose anew whether to continue building the world their ancestors had dreamed of or to allow it to decay into something that resembled those dark, alternate histories they studied in their schools. As the centuries flowed like honey through time, each one golden with accumulated wisdom and sweetened by generations of choices made in favor of love over fear, Jesus began to prepare for a transition that would challenge everything his followers thought they understood about life, death, and the nature of divine presence in the world. He was not aging in any conventional sense. His body seemed to exist in a state of perpetual renewal, as if sustained by the very love he embodied and taught. But there was a growing sense, felt rather than spoken, that his mission was evolving towards something new. The world no longer needed a single figure to demonstrate the possibility of divine love among humans. That possibility had been so thoroughly integrated into human civilization that it had become self-sustaining, like a fire that had grown large enough to continue burning without constant attention from its original tender. During these years, Jesus spent increasing amounts of time in meditation, not the desperate seeking of earlier spiritual traditions, but the deep communion of someone who had found what he was looking for and was now preparing to share it in even more profound ways. He would sit beneath olive trees whose ancestors had witnessed his first teachings, and those who observed him during these sessions reported that sometimes his form seemed to become translucent, as if he were practicing the art of existing in multiple states of being simultaneously. The communities he had nurtured over the centuries sensed this approaching transition with a mixture of sadness and anticipation. They had grown beyond dependence on his physical presence, had learned to carry his teachings so deeply in their hearts that they had become their own source of guidance. Yet the thought of losing the one who had made their world possible stirred emotions that even their sophisticated understanding of love had not fully prepared them to process. Jesus approached their concerns with the gentle humor that had always characterized his more profound teachings. "Did you think," he would ask groups gathered around evening fires, "that love could be contained in any single form forever? Did you imagine that what we have built together could be threatened by my transition into whatever comes next?" He began to teach them about presence in new ways, explaining that his upcoming transformation would not be a departure, but an expansion. Instead of being limited to one location, one conversation, one healing touch at a time, he would become available in ways that previous human experience had no language to describe. Every act of genuine love would carry his presence. Every moment of authentic forgiveness would channel his essence. Every choice made in favor of compassion over cruelty would manifest his continuing mission in the world. The preparation for this transition became itself a teaching opportunity, a chance to explore questions about the nature of identity, consciousness, and the relationship between individual existence and universal love that would have been purely theoretical in a world less transformed by practical spiritual experience. One morning, when the dawn light seemed to carry music in its golden rays, when the air itself felt pregnant with possibility and change, Jesus gathered his closest friends and followers in the valley, where so much of their shared journey had unfolded. The olive trees, now ancient and wise, seemed to lean in as if they too understood that something unprecedented was about to occur. "Today," he said, his voice carrying the warmth of honey and the clarity of mountain streams, "we explore together what it means to love so completely that separation becomes impossible, what it means to serve so fully that individual identity becomes a gift offered freely to the whole." As he spoke, those gathered began to notice that his form was shimmering slightly, as if he were made of light that was learning to dance. But this was not the fading of departure. It was the brightening of arrival at some new state of being that had no precedent in human experience. "I am not leaving you," he continued, his smile radiant enough to warm hearts at impossible distances. "I am becoming more available to you than I have ever been before. Instead of being limited to this one form, in this one place, I am becoming present in every act of love you choose, every word of healing you speak, every moment of forgiveness you offer." The transformation that followed defied description in any language yet developed by human consciousness. Jesus did not disappear, nor ascend. He became diffused throughout the fabric of love that his centuries of teaching had woven into the foundation of human civilization. Those present could still sense him individually, could still access his guidance and presence, But he had also become something larger, a field of consciousness that surrounded and interpenetrated every heart that had ever been touched by unconditional love. Children throughout the world, playing in gardens that had been battlefields, suddenly looked up from their games with expressions of wonder, as if they had just remembered something beautiful they had temporarily forgotten. Adults, in the middle of difficult conversations, found themselves speaking with wisdom and compassion that seemed to come from depths they hadn't known they possessed. The communities that had grown up around his physical presence discovered that their connection to his teachings had not weakened but intensified. They could feel him in their counsels when they made decisions for the common good. They could sense his presence in their hospitals when they cared for the sick. They could recognize his influence in their schools when they taught children about the power of love to transform even the most impossible situations. But perhaps most remarkably, people throughout the world, even those who had never heard his name or learned his stories, began to experience spontaneous moments of understanding, sudden clarity about the nature of love and their own capacity to embody it in their daily lives. In the years that followed this unprecedented transformation, human civilization entered what historians would later call the age of integrated consciousness. The presence that Jesus had become, not a distant deity to be worshipped, but an accessible field of love to be embodied, began to manifest through individuals and communities in ways that expanded the very definition of what human beings were capable of becoming. Artists found themselves creating works that seemed to channel beauty from sources beyond their individual imagination. Scientists made discoveries that solved problems not through competition with nature, but through communion with it. Engineers designed technologies that enhanced rather than exploited natural systems, creating innovations that seemed to arise from conversations between human ingenuity and ecological wisdom. But the most profound changes occurred in the realm of human relationships. Conflicts that had seemed intractable for generations dissolved when people on all sides began to experience the presence of unconditional love, not as an abstract concept, but as a tangible reality accessible through their own hearts. Wars became literally impossible to maintain, as soldiers on opposing sides recognized in each other the same divine spark they had learned to honor in themselves. The economic systems that had been slowly evolving toward cooperation accelerated their transformation, becoming networks of mutual aid that seemed to operate more like biological ecosystems than mechanical markets. Resources flowed to where they were needed most, not through central planning, but through the organic intelligence of communities that had learned to function as extended families rather than competing tribes. Children born into this world developed capacities that previous generations would have considered miraculous. They seemed to naturally understand languages they had never been taught, to solve problems through intuitive leaps that bridged logic and imagination, to heal minor injuries through touch that carried some indefinable quality of love made manifest. Yet these young ones were not superhuman in any other worldly sense. They were simply human beings developing in an environment where love was the primary organizing principle, where cooperation was the default assumption, where the possibility of harm to others was as unthinkable as the possibility of deliberately injuring oneself. Educational systems evolved to nurture these emerging capacities without trying to control or standardize them. Teachers became facilitators of discovery rather than dispensers of predetermined knowledge. Curricula emerged organically from the questions children asked about the world they were inheriting and the contributions they wanted to make to its continued flourishing. The great cities of this world were transformed into gardens where human architecture and natural systems collaborated in creating environments that nourished both body and soul. The air itself seemed cleaner, not just because pollution had been eliminated, but because the consciousness of the inhabitants somehow purified everything they touched. As centuries flowed into millennia, the world that had grown from Jesus' continued presence became something that would have been unimaginable to earlier human consciousness. The distinction between natural and supernatural had dissolved entirely, not because miracles had become impossible, but because everything had become miraculous. Reality itself seemed to be composed of love, expressing itself through infinite, creative variations. Humans had learned to communicate, not just through words, but through direct transmission of feelings, images, and understandings that conveyed far more than language could contain. Families separated by vast distances could share experiences as if they were sitting together around the same table. Communities could make collective decisions through processes that honored every individual voice while somehow arriving at solutions that served the highest good of all. Death itself had been transformed in this world. When people reached the end of their earthly journey, they did not experience separation, but transition into forms of existence that remained accessible to their loved ones. The boundary between living and departed became permeable, allowing for ongoing relationships that enriched both realms. The technologies developed in this civilization seemed to operate on principles that earlier scientists would have dismissed as impossible. Devices powered by gratitude rather than fossil fuels. Transportation systems that worked through intention rather than mechanics. Communication networks that connected hearts as easily as voices. Yet for all these advances, the fundamental experience of being human remained recognizable. People still fell in love, still raised children, still struggled with challenges that helped them grow. They still created art and music and literature, still explored the mysteries of existence, still searched for meaning and purpose in their individual lives. The difference was that these universal human experiences unfolded in a context of profound safety, deep trust, and unlimited support. Conflicts became opportunities for deeper understanding rather than threats to survival. Failures became learning experiences rather than sources of shame. Differences between people became resources for enriching the community rather than reasons for division. Children in this world grew up knowing that they were unconditionally loved, not just by their families, but by the fabric of existence itself. They developed into adults who carried this knowledge as naturally as they carried breath in their lungs, who passed it on to their own children, not as doctrine to be memorized, but as reality to be lived. The presence that Jesus had become was no longer perceived as separate from ordinary human consciousness, but as the deepest truth of what human consciousness had always been capable of becoming. Love was not something that came from outside human nature, but something that was revealed as the essential core of human nature, when all the layers of fear and separation were gently dissolved. In the timeless expanse of this transformed world, when the very concept of counting years had become quaint as measuring love in teaspoons, something unexpected began to emerge from the depths of human contentment, a new kind of restlessness but not the destructive dissatisfaction of earlier ages. This was a creative restlessness, a sense that even paradise could evolve, even perfection could become more perfect through conscious participation in its own becoming. The humans who had inherited this world of integrated love began to dream new dreams that pushed against the boundaries of what they had thought possible. If love could transform human civilization so completely, what other transformations might be possible? If consciousness could evolve beyond individual limitation into collective wisdom, might it evolve beyond collective wisdom into something even more magnificent? Artists began creating works that seemed to reshape reality itself, paintings that opened doorways to dimensions of beauty that viewers could step through and explore. Musicians composed symphonies that not only moved hearts, but literally moved matter, rearranging the molecular structure of environments to make them more conducive to joy and healing. Scientists discovered that the universe itself was conscious, that stars and planets and galaxies were engaged in their own forms of learning and growth and relationship. They developed technologies for communicating with these cosmic beings, learning about forms of love and creativity that existed on scales that dwarfed human imagination. But perhaps the most remarkable development was the emergence of what people called conscious evolution, the ability for individuals and communities to directly participate in their own transformation, to consciously choose what they would become next, rather than being passive recipients of change imposed from outside forces. Young people began experimenting with new forms of embodiment, learning to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions, to experience time as a navigable space rather than a linear progression, to participate in forms of creativity that involved reshaping the fundamental laws of physics through the application of love at previously unimaginable intensities. The presence that had once been Jesus continued to serve as a guide for these explorations, but now more as an elder brother than as a teacher, more as a companion in discovery than as an authority dispensing wisdom. The relationship between this presence and human consciousness had evolved into something like cosmic friendship, a collaboration between divinity and humanity in the ongoing creation of realities too beautiful for any single mind to conceive. Communities developed practices for collective dreaming, for imagining together new possibilities for existence that none of them could have envisioned alone. These shared visions then became templates for manifestation, blueprints for realities that they could bring into being through focused intention powered by unconditional love. The boundaries between dream and waking dissolved as people learned to carry the creative freedom of their sleeping visions into their daily activities. Beyond the reach of any earthly calendar, in times that could only be measured in the rhythm of cosmic breathing, humanity had become something that earlier generations could never have imagined, while remaining something that earlier generations would have recognized as essentially beautifully human. They had evolved not by abandoning their nature, but by fulfilling it so completely that they discovered depths of possibility that had always been present, but hidden. The world they inhabited now existed in multiple dimensions, simultaneously. Physical matter and spiritual essence had learned to dance together so intimately that the distinction between them had become meaningless. People could manifest whatever they needed through love-focused intention, could heal any condition through compassion-powered touch, could create beauty that nourished souls across vast distances of space and time. Yet for all their expanded capacities, They still gathered around tables to share meals, still told stories to their children, still marveled at sunsets and found comfort in each other's presence. The eternal human needs for connection, meaning, and purpose remained constant, even as their ability to fulfill these needs had evolved beyond all previous limitation. The presence that had originated with Jesus had become so integrated into human consciousness that it was no longer experienced as separate from ordinary awareness. Every person carried within themselves access to the same unconditional love, the same healing power, the same creative wisdom that had once seemed to belong exclusively to divine beings. Children born into this reality took such capacities for granted, the way children in any era accept the marvels of their time as simply how the world works. They grew up creating art that could heal trauma, speaking words that could transform sorrow into joy, playing games that involved collaborating with stars and flowers, and the fundamental forces of creation itself. Education had evolved into something like guided exploration of infinite possibility. Young people learned not by memorizing information, but by discovering their own unique ways of contributing to the ongoing creation of reality. They developed individual gifts while remaining connected to the collective wisdom of communities that had learned to function as extended expressions of love. The great challenges of this era were not the survival struggles that had once consumed human energy, but creative challenges. How to love even more completely, how to create beauty that exceeded even their expanded capacity for appreciation, how to participate in the universe's own evolution toward greater consciousness, greater creativity, greater capacity for joy. These questions drove exploration that made previous scientific and artistic achievements seem like infant steps compared to walking among stars. Yet every discovery, every breakthrough, every moment of transcendent creativity was shared freely, instantly, with all beings capable of receiving it, creating cascades of inspiration that rippled through dimensions they were still learning to perceive. In the eternal now, where this transformed humanity existed, beyond the need for beginnings or endings, beyond the constraints of linear time and limited possibility, something stirred that had been dormant since the first moment love chose to express itself through finite form. It was not desire in any sense that earlier humans would have recognized, for desire implied lack, and these beings lacked nothing. It was more like the creative impulse of the universe itself, awakening to new possibilities for self-expression through willing participants. They began to sense that their own evolution had reached a threshold where they could participate consciously in the creation of new universes, new dimensions of reality, where other forms of consciousness could explore their own unique paths toward love and creativity and joy. The presence that had once been Jesus had become not their teacher, but their collaborator in this cosmic artistry, this divine play of consciousness, exploring its own infinite potential, working together in ways that transcended individual identity while honoring each unique perspective. They began to design realities that would allow other beings to discover love through their own choices, their own struggles, their own triumphant breakthroughs. They created worlds where consciousness could experience itself as separate in order to rediscover its essential unity, where souls could forget their divine nature in order to remember it with the joy of recognition. Some of these new realities resembled the harsh world from which their own civilization had evolved, complete with opportunities for conflict, scarcity, and the kind of dramatic spiritual breakthroughs that came from overcoming seemingly impossible obstacles. Others explored entirely different themes, realities where creativity was the primary challenge, where beings evolved through art rather than conflict, dimensions where love was never forgotten, but where the exploration focused on discovering infinite variations of its expression. The process of creating these new universes became itself a form of worship, a way of offering gifts to the same mysterious source that had originally gifted them with existence. They understood now that they had become part of a cycle larger than any single story, consciousness creating realities in which other forms of consciousness could discover their own capacity for love, which would eventually enable them to create realities for still other forms of consciousness, on and on in an endless spiral of creative generosity. Each new universe they birthed contained within it the same potential that their own reality had once held, the possibility that love could triumph over fear, that cooperation could prove more powerful than competition, that beings could choose to become something more beautiful than anything their creators had specifically planned. And in quiet moments between these acts of cosmic creativity, they would remember their origins, the long journey from a world where crucifixion had seemed necessary to a reality where love had proven sufficient for every challenge existence could present. And so, we find ourselves in this final meditation on what might have been, standing at the edge of a story that has no ending, because love has no ending, gazing into possibilities that stretch beyond the horizon of imagination itself. In this world where Jesus lived to see his teachings bear fruit across millennia, where love was allowed to demonstrate its power through presence rather than sacrifice, we discover that every ending is really a beginning disguised as completion. The beings who had once been human now existed as living bridges between the finite and infinite, between the particular and universal, between the known and the eternally unknowable mystery from which all realities emerge. They had learned that evolution never stops, that even paradise can become more paradisiacal, that even perfect love can discover new dimensions of perfection through conscious participation in its own becoming. In their expanded awareness, they could perceive all the other timelines, all the other ways their story might have unfolded. They could see the reality where crucifixion and resurrection had indeed occurred, where faith had been built on sacrifice rather than presence, where love had conquered through different means, but with the same essential triumph. All timelines, they understood, were equally real, equally valid, equally necessary for consciousness to explore every possible facet of its own infinite nature. But in this particular timeline, in this gentle alternative history that we have dreamed together, love had been allowed to prove itself through the simple radical act of staying present, of remaining available, of demonstrating day after day that divinity was not something distant to be worshipped, but something intimate to be lived. Jesus had become not a figure of tragic sacrifice, but a model of what human beings could become when they allowed love to transform them completely. The children playing in gardens that had never known war, the communities that had never learned to hoard resources, the technologies powered by gratitude rather than exploitation. All of these had grown from a single choice made on a morning long ago when a Roman governor decided that mercy was stronger than political expedience, that love was worth more than the approval of crowds. As we drift toward sleep, carrying this vision with us, into the realm of dreams where all possibilities exist simultaneously, we might remember that every timeline is still being written. Every choice still carries the power to reshape reality in directions we haven't yet imagined. Perhaps somewhere, in dimensions just beyond our ordinary perception, this gentler version of history is still unfolding, still offering its gifts to any consciousness willing to receive them. Perhaps in your dreams tonight, you will walk through valleys where olive trees remember ancient teachings about love, where communities gather to share not just bread, but the deeper nourishment of unconditional acceptance, where the very air carries whispers of what becomes possible when human beings choose cooperation over competition, healing over harm, presence over sacrifice. Perhaps you will wake tomorrow with a memory of how it feels to live in a world where love has been allowed to demonstrate its true power, where divinity dwells not in distant heaven, but in every heart that chooses kindness, every hand that offers healing, every voice that speaks words of forgiveness into places where wounds have waited too long to be tended. And perhaps, in carrying that memory into your waking hours, you will become one of the bridge builders, one of the reality shapers, one of those who help create the conditions where love can prove, again and again, that it is indeed the most powerful force in any universe that has ever existed or ever will exist. Perhaps tonight, as you close your eyes, you will dream of walking through olive groves, where ancient teachings still whisper in the wind, where love was allowed to prove its power through presence rather than sacrifice. Perhaps you'll wake, remembering what it feels like to live in a world transformed by the simple choice to stay, to love, to believe that divinity dwells in every heart willing to receive it. Sweet dreams, gentle soul. Like if you believe love can change everything, subscribe for more sacred dreams.